agree? Do you feel like you're speaking about the same thing?
Well, it sounded as if we had had a conversation before we met today. So yes, I think so. I think we agree on the why. The urgency, I love that. Explore the urgency of what you do. If it's not urgent, then don't do it. I really believe in that. And I also believe in redefining structures. And I should be careful saying that, being the director of the Norwegian Arts Council, because then you have to invite me back, by the way, in a year or so to see how it all went. So, but yeah, I think there are common messages.
Yeah. I think in a way you also spoke from different angles. You're very specific in putting the artistic intelligence in the center, or work, the curatorial work.
Yeah, I think as a curator, the position is always to look very, very closely at what artists do, and there is a lot to be seen there. But and that's my point. I think administration also needs to look very closely at what artists are doing.
Mm.
For me, it's sorry. Yeah. For me, it's very clear that it's a political and a social question. Anytime you're dealing with budgets, public budgets, taxpayers' money, and you're placing it someplace, it's a political question. You cannot just say, oh, well, yeah, but this is art. I mean, we have our money. We have our natural 2% that we get every year from the national budget, and that we're allowed to kind of do what we want with. No, of course not. There are very clear, as long as we're talking about publicly financed culture. I think it's very important, at least everything that I was saying, and I think most of us were talking about, is still about in the area of publicly financed culture. We're not talking about the commercial culture. We're not talking about selling tickets. We're not talking about that which is based on popular demand or on marketing or in that way. So therefore, our audiences, this connection, citizen-visitor, is for me very, very important.
Mm. Kristin, you're quite new at your position at the Art Council. What will be your first step in reshaping that organization?
Well, it's a bit about what I said about asking the question why, because we celebrated, the Arts Council of Norway celebrated its 50th anniversary last year. So now we have to look at our structures and see, are we still administered and organized the way we should be? Are we listening to the new needs of our audiences? Because my fear would be that the Arts Council of Norway will recreate old debates and old discussions. So I think we should be more of a spokes body, of a development body, as both of you talked about as well, instead of being sort of a function of administrating a lot of money. We need to sort of have our ear to the ground and make sure that we actually meet the needs of the field that we are there to serve. We're not important in ourselves. It's what comes out of the Arts Council that's interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Just a quick response. I don't think it's about how Statens Kulturråd or Statens Konstråd are organized. Because actually your organization is there in order to administrate where the change is actually supposed to take place, which is in the cultural investments that you make. There is a question whether or not anything in your organization prevents them from developing, from daring to fail, or creates conditions for them to dare to explore completely new territories. So in fact, the Arts Council can be organized in a very traditional way, in my opinion, just like the tax authorities or the telephone company. However, the way you distribute your money and to whom you distribute the money and invest in, that's another question.
But that's a question of competence, so that is a question of structure. Because you have to have the right people and the right structures and the right advisors to make the right decisions, and that's a structural issue.
Yeah. As Magdalena was saying, if the funders don't recognize the good ideas or can't see the developing ideas, where do we head then?
Also, I'm very interested, how can we learn from all the projects that we fund? Because what I see is that sometimes we invent the wheel and then we burn it every time, And if you go back in our archives to see what kind of applications have we received, because we receive about 20,000 applications per year, and we've done so for 50 years. There's so much knowledge in that base, and I'd like to dig into that. And I think you have to fail in order to learn. I keep telling that to my kids. We learned that from Silicon Valley. Yay, I made a mistake, We don't do that in the arts industry because we're so ideal. We seek perfection, you know, and that's a good thing. But in order to actually reach perfection, we need to make a lot of mistakes on the way. So if we can learn from those mistakes, if we can systematically put that into a structure in the public agencies, I think that would be interesting. That would be an interesting outcome.
Is there also a possibility of greater sharing? Sometimes I think the art is very upptagen of originality and in a way copywriting their own projects. I mean, working with participatory art, is it possible to share methods?
I mean, we work a lot with especially European colleagues in sharing methodologies and approaches and advocacy and whatever. And we are also, as a state agency, working on how can we contribute to other actors, both nationally and internationally. I think that's the difference between, if you're a company, a private company, you want to profit on what you think out. But if you're a cultural actor, publicly funded, you can share what you find.
So it could be a situation where organizations like yours also are omvärldsanalytiker sharing good ideas or good ways of working?
I think that's very good. We have a lot of collaboration with Norway, for instance, our sister organization there.
I mean, this is the question of the European context. I mean, we have a massively wonderful opportunity of learning from 28 different countries, and of course, our Nordic countries, we share so much of our history culturally and politically and economically that you know, the contrasts are not always so great. The beauty is in contrast. We learn from when we're not mirrored by somebody, but when somebody actually challenges us. And one of the things in terms of participation and in terms of cooperation, one of the things that I've learned very much by working in the Balkans and in Southeast Europe and in Central Europe is that many of the independents, because there is no tradition of them getting any support whatsoever from either the state or anyone else, they're completely dependent on their own initiative and the power of their own initiative. Therefore, they share much more willingly. The independent sector in Sweden today, for example, is constantly competing and very seldom sharing either technical resources or spaces or communication devices or audiences. We don't tell about another colleague's work in order to protect our audience, whereas in countries where there is not this developed infrastructural investment from the state, except for a few very national institutions, they share. And because cooperation is, in fact, much more effective.
It's the more you give, the more you get. It's like Elon Musk told us when he opened up his Tesla code. You know, how do I actually invent the batteries? How did I make the batteries last for 500 kilometers instead of 50? Because he wants someone out there to hack them to make them better. But it's a very interesting balance between open source and copyright. Yes. And I think that's the problem for public institutions like us, to make sure that we share methods, we share APIs, we share systems, we share policies. I think organizations are pretty good at this. When it comes to the artistic development, there's a fine line. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we have, that we can give good advice to the artists. What should you share and what should you desperately keep to yourself? You know.
I wanted to pick up on something that you talked about with humility, because I think that's key when we talk about audiences. There is this, in the more traditional way of talking about an audience, is like they don't know, we should educate them. And I think we really deeply have to reconsider.
Yes.
So when we work in the Million programs, we learn incredibly much. These are the experts on those areas. They know exactly what's going on there. We come as guests from outside. And I think if we have to, for me, that would be the key issue of audience. I think rethinking audience, to be very, very respectful to the knowledge and to that those are individuals in the middle of their lives, just like we are. And I think that relationship is, for me at least, the key issue.
This is excellently said, Magdalena, and I just want to underline what I said about artists. I think the key is really the artist. I think it's the artist's humility, not just the institutional humility or the leadership humility, where artists really are curious about what their audiences want. And what we're finding out is that there's a whole new generation of artists coming that is interdisciplinary, intercultural, and seriously engaged with the audience, which means that, for example, at the City Theatre of Rotterdam, the director, a dear friend of mine, can't find young directors who want to make performances on the large stage because they all want to be in the subway, in an apartment, and something like that. And they say, no, why would I want to commit suicide and walk onto a stage and play for 2,000 people where they can hardly see me and they have to look through these glasses? That's not the kind of art I want to do. That's not the kind of art that's relevant for the people I want to reach. And therefore, the institutional building is suddenly in the way for the development of the social and creative artistic scene.
So we are opening up for questions from the audience. I think we have people with microphones. I can't really see you. So raise your hand if you have questions. And please tell your name before you ask your question.
Anyway.
I see one hand there.
Hi, my name is Sabrina. I come from the University of Copenhagen. I was very inspired by your talk, so thank you so much for that. And here in the end, you talk a little about the problem with copyright versus open source. Because what is artists and curators going to do in the future if they are going to be open source, they all want to share, they all want to have audiences participate? How are they going to make a living? Do you have any answer for that?
No, but I'd like to comment on that because I think that's something we debate too little. And the Conservative Party in Oslo recently suggested that we should cut down the copyright on a artwork from 70 years, which means that the artist will most likely be dead, to 5 years. Because the arts...
will most likely be dead.
Yeah. But it's interesting because we should really have a focus on that now because these are decisions... the politicians' rhetoric is that, well, most art is funded by the public anyway, so why should it be funded twice? So, and then there's this huge debate going on at the moment, and obviously we shake our heads, but we're in here in this closed room. We have to really listen about that conversation. So I'm sorry, no, I wish I had the answers. Maybe we can have a chat over coffee and you can teach me whatever you know, because I think we have to have our eyes and ears open in that respect.
We should just be a bit careful, if I may say, about connecting this question of artist survival and copyright with this question of audience, because the audiences, excuse me, my language, don't give a shit. The audiences, the kids out there that are listening to sampled music from hip-hoppers, and they're making their own, and they're stealing, and they're buying, and they're distributing. I mean, they don't care about who the original one was, and they don't even really care if the artist is rich or poor. So it's really a question of finding, not keeping these two things separated. The one is, how are artists going to make money on their works? And today, the artists are not making money except for a very few. It's the producers, the record distributors, the movie distributors, they are the ones that are winning by this copyright, this permanent copyright system. So I don't think copyright and relationships with audiences are connected at all.
I think there's a point in that. I think this is more a leadership challenge for all artists. You know, self-management. Yes. When you come out from school and you have no idea how do I take care of my creative, what's it called, property? Creative property versus Creative Commons. But I also believe in sharing when it comes to applications to an arts council, because I'm very interested in learning more about the non-successful applications. So if we get 20,000 applications every year, more or less 25% are successful. But that doesn't mean that the other 75% are not interesting. So I'm, playing with ideas that how can we learn from the 75% failures, as it were? How can they evaluate? I had this conversation with an interesting audience developer, Alan Brown, in Stavanger at the Norwegian conference that was recently. And he said, why don't you put the 75% non-successful applicators, why don't you set them to actually review the successful applications? So how can we learn from each other? Because it's not as if they're good and they're bad. There's so many borderlines here. So that's a learning that I would be interested in, finding systems and structures and methods, and how can we learn from that, from the non-successful applicants.
Magdalena, do you have something to say on the question?
No, I would just say that it's important and that we have to bear in mind the intellectual property of artists and find... I think it's possible to share a lot of things and maintain that. I don't think it necessarily needs to be a conflict, but one has to be aware of how to navigate it, not to kind of lose it with the total common sharing of everything.
Mm-hmm. Do we have another question? Hi.
Hello, my name is Sanna Sevika Hansson. I'm from Sweden. I think this was really interesting, what you're saying, and I really like how Magdalena and you, Kristin, how you work really a lot with the organization and in different ways, like sort of the infrastructure, like Magdalena was talking about, and you sort of touched the more towards what is it, näringsindustrin?
Creative industries?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this is a very important thing, because I think in the future I think culture must be much more friendly and open to the näringsliv. And so I think what you were sort of touching when you said about a corporate open source and corporate copyright, I think that's one thing I think one can work a lot. And then the second, I was thinking, like, none of you really touched, which is sort of a very big part, I think. It's the digital thing. So this, I think we should talk about also, because that is a lot. And especially if you were talking about all this 25,000, I think that's really interesting. And I myself, I'm a designer, an artist, entrepreneur, I do a lot of things. And I think I work very much at that, a little bit like Magdalena. I create for each project, I do different things. It's almost like a big, build up a new cooperation. And so I think when you have this application you're talking about, I think all the application, they are so badly structured. And it's a lot about like, what you should need and budget. They asking the wrong questions, and also who are who, and what are their backgrounds. So I think that is also why a lot of interesting project doesn't come, and a lot of people, they don't feel like they are applying. So I think this is a big, like a huge thing.
Yeah.
I think you should really reconsider.
So asking the wrong questions in applications, is that something you...
We actually did an experiment in this when we had civil society apply for a place or a situation. We had a very, very simple form, and then we selected a lot more than we would do, and then we went out to all of them and talked to them.
So
and to understand, does this have a potential, even though they're not good at writing applications? Because we didn't want only the strong civil society, the old traditional civil society, to get the funding and to get the projects. And we had to go out there to look. And in that process, we learned so much. So yes, I think that's definitely, and I think kind of asking the people who fill in the forms, how do you feel? Is this a relevant questions? And it's like you get 30,000 and you have to have gender equality and access for disabled and youth and everything for 30,000 crowns for a project. It's crazy. So could we perhaps diversify and be able to go into depth? And yes, all of that needs, I totally agree with you.
Would that be building human structures as you were?
Well, certainly. I mean, one of the things about applications is that they're evaluated by people who are not often themselves the artists or themselves even the target audience. And I wonder if there is some way to engage the audience in the actual application process. The audiences are the last link in the chain. It's like they get it after everything has already been fixed, paid, funded, rehearsed, prepared, and then the audience kind of gets whatever comes out. Sometimes it's brilliant, sometimes it's not. I think that we need to engage them. On the other hand, I just to be a little bit critical of the idea about the applications being wrong. I mean, as EU financing consultants, we're getting all this, these EU projects, it's so terrible, hundreds of pages, I can't even fill it in, we don't even bother anymore because it's too difficult. But the reality is that I've done many applications, even failed ones, But it's in the making of the application that I understand how those who want to invest in us think. It's not about ask me the question that I want to answer. It's a question about how do I explain what I want to do to those people who are going to invest in it and who have other kinds of priorities than what I have. So I think that we need to be kind of more responsive. On the other hand, I don't think that we have to be careful that we don't turn it into a language that only certain people are able to write and the most interesting projects. So what you just said is very good, is that, and we have proposed this to the EU, is that there would be first a short list. That is, a very short, quick description of what you want, and then once they've made a short list, then they ask you for more in-depth, concrete things like budgeting and timing and phases and things like this that you may not have thought about yourself. But to get everybody to do all that work and then have only 5% of the applications be successful, that's 95% wasted time, and we should be careful about wasting artists' time.
Yeah. And now we have 30 seconds. So no more question, but sum up, round up. Would you like to say something quick from the session for the listeners to take with them before they go to coffee?
Well, I think we agree that why, ask the question why, and do it again and again. You'll never finish with answering that. And secondly, when it comes to leadership, we had that discussion over lunch earlier today, that we talk about the bad leaders. We spend a lot of time talking about bad leaders. Don't waste your time doing that. And then we treat good leaders as geniuses. Well, they're not. I think we should focus on 80% is probably in between. And what worries me is that they are reasonably satisfied, So whatever kind of leadership we need is that someone really wants something, Go out and come up with the good ideas. Don't sit around and wait for the Ministry for Cultural Affairs or the Arts Council to tell you what to do. Just go out there and do it. That's leadership.
Yeah.
Well, at the risk of saying something that's maybe either too obvious or too radical or provocative, but in fact, let's remember that the arts are not about the artists and what they want. The arts are about the audience and those who are receiving it. And therefore, what we have to do is empower the conditions which allow audiences to meet artists or to meet artworks. So let's focus on the intended targets and more, because I think that we spend an awful lot of time trying to keep artists satisfied, but we're finding out that they're getting more and more marginalized from the popular discussion. And that marginalization is much more dangerous than that a few artists are not being understood.
Magdalena?
Well, I'd just like to problematize slightly. I think I'm extremely interested in the audience. I think we have to understand how artists are interested in audiences, or those artists that are, because I think that's the key. Because artists read their time in a specific way. And I think there is a risk when we should remember that when I go to university, I don't want to decide which books to read. And it's the same, when I'm an audience, I would like to be surprised. I don't want to say, this is what I want. I would like someone to challenge me and to surprise me. And that, I think, is extremely important. We should be humble and listening, but we should also be able to give people, make them reach up for things that they didn't even think they would reach.
Thank you so much. It's time for coffee right outside.